report, so I'll throw it back to you, Director Atkinson.
Thank you, Chris. I see Chairperson Green is on the meeting now, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting back over to her.
I am so sorry. I was having technical problems this morning. Okay, next we'll have a report, the REROC report from Vicki Osborne.
Morning, thank you, ma'am. Yeah, it's a mouthful, huh, that acronym. So I thought for the Happy New Year report, and Happy New Year to everyone, Vicki Osborne, Director of Emergency Management with WEROC, kind of do a recap of last year and the things that WEROC has done to support our member agencies. So obviously COVID is still the hot topic of the day with Omicron. We continue to have our biweekly calls. We even now have city emergency managers joining the WEROC call because we continue to have those meetings every 2 weeks to update information we receive from OSHA, the county, the states. One of the big items we are supporting our member agencies right now with is testing kits, which you've heard me make this kind of pun joke a couple times this week, is that's the toilet paper of 2022, as they're very hard to find. So we continue to support. We have many of our agencies that have taken up WEROC on jumping on that rapid kit order. So we're trying to get those and procure those. So COVID remains a big topic of coordination for us. Another item of achievement, I can say the 24 agencies that participated in the American Water Infrastructure Act project successfully completed their certification with EPA for their risk resiliency assessments and also their ERP updates and reviews. So that was a very big scope of work project that Director Seckel started before I came on board. And I know that he's very happy to see that come to an end too, and everyone was able to successfully meet their compliance and provide EPA with their certification needs. Training and exercises, even with COVID, we were able to supply training to our member agencies that took a part of it. To give you an idea of savings that we provided, we did transition from in-person to virtual training. We still conducted approximately 12 different trainings, 6 of those being specific to the National Incident Management System. So those 6 courses, if we would have brought in a contractor, that would have cost $120,000 to our agencies. Since I am a certified instructor, it costs our agencies nothing. So that's a great deal I like to always pass on, where we are able to do some savings. We had our first WEROC symposium virtually. We had about 110 attendees. We have Kevin Morley from AWWA on. We talked about a lot of different type lessons learned. A lot had to do with cybersecurity and what's coming down the pipe. We also had Texas Warn, so that's the Water Agency Response Network at Texas, come in and talk about the Texas freeze. And a lot of what we talked about was the legislative issues that came after, because they put in some legislative that had the choose your own adventures of 28 different options how you could become resilient for emergencies. So that was a great presentation. And then other planning activities that we've had over the course of the past year, we started our cybersecurity working group in partnership with the OCIAC. Unfortunately, cyber is a huge impact for our infrastructure agencies. Just over the course of the past year, we have had 7 events of cyber in Orange County with our water agencies. So this working group is going to become even more important to share information and best practices. We also updated a lot of procedural documents in correlation and in partnership with our member agencies, including the Alert OC, updating the MOU, but also now we're providing training with our member agencies that are using that mass notification system. We also have updated our 800 megahertz radio procedures and are helping our agencies continue with providing that training. We updated our activation requests, the overarching WEROC emergency operations plan, the water liaison for the command post. So we did have a very busy year, and I think we got a lot done even with COVID, which is fantastic. And just to give you an idea with WEROC, what's going on in regards to events, last year we responded, helped coordinated, provided information, or provided resources for 23 events last year, either being supply chain shortages, equipment needs, cyber events. We had a couple, we had a fire event where we did some coordinating activity, the pipeline, the oil spill that happened, we were helping the county with information, public safety power shutoffs. So it was a very exciting year for water in regards to emergency events. They're not going away. Instead, we're gonna see them continue to move on. I'm going to close this real quick, and I appreciate the time with talking about the WeRock EOC, because I've had a few folks ask where that project's at. So we are still seeking funding. We have met with the county. We did, and Heather, jump in if you want to throw in any on this. We did submit the WeRock project for federal appropriations. We were really excited. We made the short list, but then we didn't make the short list. And unfortunately, our EOC project was cut from the 12 projects that were put on that appropriations list. We continue to seek funding. As I'm done with this call today, I will be putting my notice of interest in for hazard mitigation funding. So that's due on the 22nd. We'll see what goes from there. Currently, we are in the phase 1 design process, which was approved by the MODOC board. So we are currently meeting. We had our first kickoff meeting. We have our second meeting next week with our goal to have that 30% kind of oversight or report out we'll be able to give to y'all by March of this year. So that's kind of where we are. We will continue to seek funding. If any of you want to provide funding, WeRock is always willing to accept any help that we can to get this dream to come true. And that's all I have. Thank you, ma'am.
All right. Thank you, Vicki. Next, we have the Met report, and Director Erdman's going to give us this report this morning.
Yes, good morning, Kathy. I'm happy to be
Dennis.
stepping in for Director Ackerman today, who's traveling. The Metropolitan staff continues to place great emphasis on finding solutions to those areas of the Met system that exclusively get State Water Project water. The agenda for December included the following action items in their consent calendar. One was to amend the capital investment program for the fiscal year 20 and 21 to include water supply and reliability improvements for the Rialto pipeline area. Number 2 was to award an $11,499,000 contract to J.F. Shea Construction for seismic upgrades at the Casaloma Siphon Barrel number 1, and to authorize a $1.1 million increase in the agreement with Carollo Engineers supporting that project. They also awarded a $32.8 million contract to J.F. Shea Construction for upgrade of the domestic water treatment systems of the 5 Colorado River aqueduct pumping plants. Went on to authorize the general manager to enter into a memorandum of understanding to facilitate near-term actions to maintain the elevation of water in Lake Mead above elevation 1,020 feet, and to provide up to 20% of the non-federal cost share of any such actions. This later turned out to be the 500 plus plan that was discussed and was signed during the Colorado River Water Users Association. They went on to authorize the general manager to enter into agreements with San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District and the California Department of Water Resources to improve the management of the state water project supplies, including exchange water. Item 7.6 authorized the general manager to enter into agreements with San Diego County Water Authority, Semi-Tropic Water Storage, and the California Department of Water Resources to purchase water, lease groundwater return capacity, exchange water, and to convey water in the state water project facilities. Went on to authorize the implementation of modifications to the on-site retrofit program. Item 7.8 adopted resolution to support Metropolitan's application to the California Department of Water Resources 2021 Urban and Multi-Benefit Drought Relief Program of $7.5 million to supplement funding for residential and commercial landscapes within the turf replacement program, and $2.5 million to supplement funding for the residential direct install program. The board also had on the agenda to establish a specific parliamentary procedure. That item was deferred and discussion will continue. That concludes the Met actions for December. I will leave you with a little known water fact. Giulio Boccatelli, in his book called The Biography of Water, states that if all of the water that is condensed, that is present in the atmosphere is condensed, it would form a layer 2 centimeters thick. So I leave you with that today. And thank you, Kathy. Back to you.
Well, thank you, Dennis. Okay, next I will give our aqua report. On the state side, indoor water use efficiency standard, the Department of Water Resources, DWR, and the State Water Board recently submitted a report to the legislature recommending that urban water supplies achieve an indoor water use efficiency standard of 55 gallons per capita per day by 2023, declining to 47 gallons per day by 2025 and 42 gallons by 2030 and beyond. The standards would be implemented at the water supplier level. Aqua submitted comments to DWR, raising concerns with DWR's assessment of impacts to water and wastewater. The State Water Board is expected to initiate the formal rulemaking for water loss. Under the regulation, each urban retail water supplier would be required to comply by 2028 with an individualized volumetric water loss standard based on real loss using the economic model developed by the State Water Board and the supplier's own unique data. The start of the formal rulemaking will initiate a 45-day public comment period with input from an ongoing working group. Aqua will be providing comments. Next, State Water Project, SWP allocation for 2022. It was announced, DWR announced in December, its initial State Water Project allocation for 2022, that is essentially zero. The decision reflects California drought conditions and the anticipation of a third dry year. Next, with the State Water Board drought updates this week, the State Water Board adopted regulations to prohibit water waste and bolster water conservation. The regulation makes wasteful water practices such as excessive irrigation causing runoff or use of potable water for street cleaning a violation for all Californians. Aqua submitted a comment letter and actively encourages members to help their customers reduce water use to meet the governor's voluntary water use reduction of 15% compared to 2020 levels. Next, on water quality updates, Aqua submitted written comments to the State Water Board in regard to the draft program environmental impact report for the adoption of regulation of the hexavalent chromium maximum contaminant level, encouraging recirculating the notice preparation of all responsible agencies, further consideration of technical and economic issues in development of the EIR and development of the new public health goal for hexavalent chromium. And the state board recently released the draft proposed standardized methods for testing and testing reporting plan for microplastics in drinking water. Aqua submitted a joint comment letter with the California Water Association that reiterates that microplastic standards must be feasible for public water agencies. Next, on groundwater trading, Aqua submitted comments to the California Water Commission on a state role in guiding groundwater trading. Aqua supports the commission's work that calls on the state to create flexibility for groundwater sustainability agencies to trade water within barriers by enabling and incentivizing transactional approaches, including groundwater markets with rules that safeguard natural resources, small and medium-sized farms, and water supply quality for disadvantaged communities. Now, on the federal side, Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, the law provides $8.3 billion for various Western water programs. Through the work of WACO and a national coalition of more than 200 agricultural, urban, and municipal water entities, significant investments can be found in the package to support drought relief, increase water infrastructure resilience, and combat and reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. WACO distributed an advisory that includes more information and funding highlights that is available on www.aqua.com. Next, on the waters of the United States, WOTUS update. On December 7th, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Army Corps of Engineers officially published a proposed rule to revise a definition of WOTUS. The agencies launched a 60-day comment period with comments due on February 7th. AQUA is tracking this issue closely and plans to weigh in during the public comment period. Next, on COVID-19 relief funding taxability, the United States Internal Revenue Service issued guidance in November clarifying that assistance for water bills provided to individuals through the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, for COVID-19 relief will not be considered taxable income. Both the California's senators have signed the Senate letter, and 21 members of the delegation signed the House letter. And finally, upcoming events, ask the agency manager how telematics can benefit your organization webinar will be January 13th. And Washington, D.C. 2022 conference will be March 1st through 3rd. All right. Thank you, everybody, for your reports. Any questions? All right. If anybody needs a copy of my report, just let me know. Program introduction. And now I am excited to introduce our program and speakers. Austin Ewell and Scott Hamilton have joined us today to provide a presentation on the water blueprint for the San Joaquin Valley. Austin Ewell is the executive director of the water blueprint for the San Joaquin Valley. He is familiar with the complex political and geographical challenges facing Western resources. Austin is involved in various land, environmental, and water matters throughout California. His passion for creating value through relationships and collaboration have greatly aided his success in the areas of development, conservation, and resolution. His commitment to the natural resources has allowed for preservation of thousands of acres that provide wildlife corridors, habitat areas, while equally allowing for private and public benefit. Austin is a licensed California attorney and real estate broker who provides consultation to clients on a full range of federal, state, and local matters. Next, Scott Hamilton serves as the chairman of the technical committee for the water blueprint for the San Joaquin Valley. He earned his PhD in agriculture and resource economics from Oregon State University and has been engaged in water issues in California for more than 30 years. He served on the board of Coahuila Water District for 2 decades, where he initiated and directed the implementation of water banking programs and the financing and expansion of the district's distribution and recharge system. Over the last decade, Dr. Hamilton has also worked to bring better science to regulations that affect water supplies. He currently serves as co-chair of the Delta Smelt Technical Team with the Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program. Austin and Scott, we're looking forward to hearing your presentation and learning more about your organization. Please take it away.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. And I'll kick things off and then turn them over to Scott. I assume you can hear me, and if for some reason you can't or something occurs, just let me know. But first and foremost, thank you very much for the opportunity to kind of share with you what we're doing or trying to do here in the San Joaquin Valley of California. And as noted kind of on this slide, there is some significant collaboration occurring here in the Central Valley of California, somewhat kind of for the first time in quite some time, where you've got a kind of a new group of leadership. And so hence some of the pictures there on the right of the diverse individuals that are helping on this collaborative effort. And so one of those efforts that I'll talk a little bit about and also reference another one, just which kind of highlights the collaboration here in the Valley. But one is the Water Blueprint, which was referenced earlier. And another kind of equal effort in coordination is the San Joaquin Valley Water Collaborative Action Program, both with equal pursuits, both in coordination and ultimately trying to put together a plan recognizing the unique set of crossroads that we find ourselves in the water space with the implementation of Sigma, with water management operations, which were highlighted, somewhat earlier in through Met's report, but really what to plan for the future and to try to come up with a plan, and as it's implemented for the betterment of the Valley and its residents in the future. So next slide. One of the first efforts really underway was recognizing with the implementation and the passage of Sigma in 2014, and then with the respective implementation timelines, we first and foremost wanted to kind of understand the issue before us, really what I'll refer to kind of as the gap. Understanding the demand, and then understanding the resources that were available to meet that demand, and then identifying what would happen or could happen if nothing is done and it essentially is kind of the status quo, and are there opportunities to better the situation moving forward. And so roughly what's been estimated based upon looking at the current demand, both relative to existing industries, which predominantly here in the San Joaquin Valley is agriculture, as well as the communities that rely on those water sources, both in ground and surface water sources, and then in turn the environmental needs for those same water sources. And so really what was shown is that given the current kind of constraints, operations, climate change, settlement implementations, et cetera, we're looking at roughly anywhere from a 2 to 3 million acre foot gap in water supply year in and year out. And so if nothing was done, as I mentioned, kind of the status quo, we recognize that you're looking at roughly 1 million acres of productive farmland that would be removed from production. And that equates to roughly 1 million of the 5 million that make up agricultural production here in the San Joaquin Valley. And so in taking that acreage out, assuming that there aren't any changes in water availability management or other sources, you're looking at, approximately about 42,000 jobs lost just in agriculture alone. And again, an extension of that due to the fact that that industry affects so much and is the cornerstone of the economies within the San Joaquin Valley, as well as other aspects within the state, but looking at, a total of about 65,000 jobs, again, in the whole San Joaquin Valley annually. And that equates to roughly about $7 billion a year in lost revenues, as well as what that means to lost property taxes and what those taxes produce for the respective municipalities and civic services. And what we really saw in the analysis, and happy to share at any later time on how these numbers were put together, and it was done in coordination with Dr. David Sundig from UC Berkeley, an economist and a chair professor there at UC Berkeley, who'd gone through to analyze kind of what that removal of that agricultural sector might mean. And unfortunately, it significantly adversely affects those that need assistance the most, the predominant disadvantaged communities that are abundant throughout the San Joaquin Valley, and really highlight, the issue that will affect those economically, as well as those issues associated with drinking water supplies. And so, seeing that was somewhat of the future before us, as I mentioned before, a group of us and a growing group of us from respective caucuses recognized that those of us in the San Joaquin Valley didn't necessarily want that to be our future. And so what could we do in somewhat of a unique manner, which hadn't been done? How could we come together and plan for tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, of what we wanted the Valley to look like through collaborative and proactive efforts in working with the respective interest groups that historically have not worked together. Next slide. And so, as you can see, those respective caucuses, and okay, I didn't realize that it was a slow rollout. Adds drama. And so, really, both kind of, as I mentioned before, the Water Blueprint, which I serve as the voluntary executive director for, as well as I serve on the steering committee and the planning committee for the San Joaquin Valley Collaborative Action Program. The respective caucuses that have come to the table that historically have not worked together include advocates for the safe drinking water, disadvantaged communities, as well as environmental NGOs in and around the state and the nation, local government, which is fundamental, especially here in the San Joaquin Valley, for those areas that were lands that were not annexed into districts and fall within kind of the purview of those counties under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and those GSAs that were formed. And as I mentioned before, industry is at the table, farmers and agricultural industry, including ranchers, and then also the water managers, so the water districts and water agencies. And have, in this effort, kind of created what we call kind of a large tent and are at the table to have the discussions of what can each do individually and in coordination kind of today and moving forward to address those significant issues that I laid out earlier on the impacts that will occur to all the respective caucuses if kind of nothing is done. Go ahead, next slide. So as I mentioned before, the water supply gap is tremendous, and 2 to 3 million acre feet is a significant amount of water. And so identifying that challenge is before us and probably is the most significant because so much of this is interconnected and relies on those water supplies. And so, but from that gap, it leads to, it's probably, first and foremost, the issue and fundamental right for people to have access to safe, reliable and affordable drinking water. And in turn, with those loss of water supplies, we've just seen about 95% loss of functional ecosystem habitat. And over the years, especially with aged infrastructure, the change in climate, what that means for hydrology and precipitation. There just is inadequate physical and natural infrastructure to capture and store that water when it's available for those times when water isn't plentiful. And really, to do a lot of these things, in talking to the respective caucuses, we've realized there needs to be alignment, and it's because of, maybe not surprisingly, inconsistent local, state, and kind of federal policies that make it challenging to kind of move forward and to kind of make those changes and implement some of these solutions that we've been working for. So just kind of, these are the 5 kind of consistent challenges that we faced. And ultimately, once identifying those challenges as a group, the respective caucuses, which might surprise you or it might not, was an effort in and of itself to get all of the caucuses to kind of agree on what our respective challenges were. Because historically, people have looked kind of at the only issue before them based upon their interest and not necessarily at the respective interests of others. And so that was a very successful outcome of this effort. And then ultimately looking at how do we solve for these problems. And so if you go ahead and change the next slide. And so as I mentioned, the demands and the issues before us, and then really trying to look at what are those solutions, which are going to be fundamental to changing the status quo, to not allowing what was laid out before, the significant economic, significant human effects of what occurs without adequate water supplies here in the San Joaquin Valley, and what it means not only to the valley but to the state as a whole. And so this group of 70 plus kind of individuals and memberships and agencies made up kind of generally in those 5 caucuses that I referenced have committed towards working towards solutions. And so part of that is eliminating this demand supply gap and the long-term overdraft, but doing that with equal efforts to reduce the demand, which is inherent. So land is going to have to come out of production. We're going to have to repurpose land. The status quo of what's occurring now on hardened demand and supplies from a farming standpoint are not going to occur in the future. And I think there is that recognition and acceptance that's growing throughout the valley. But when we reduce that, we also need to have an equal effort on increasing the supply. And so that means looking at local water supplies and maximizing the use of local supplies as we can, capturing those supplies as they come and when they come, but then also looking at the Delta, but doing so in a much more transparent and open manner, and studying it on a science-based standpoint to say, are there excess supplies? PPIC has put out historically reports showing, upwards of, on average, of 10 million acre feet of unregulated flow that is there. Is there some percentage of that amount that can be captured and moved as flood flows and moved into the system and recharged within the San Joaquin Valley and other areas? The other is assuring that there's rapid action to provide universal access to safe, reliable, and affordable drinking water. As I referenced before, this previous year, which was historic from a hydrology standpoint, again highlighted the need and the necessity that we work collectively to make sure that people have access to water, just as a human fundamental right. And together we hope the caucuses can help assure that. The other is to really create one of the largest ecosystem restoration programs in the country. Again, all these items very daunting, but doing so together provides us some opportunity at success. And also initiating a valley-wide, San Joaquin Valley-wide effort to coordinate changes in how land use is accomplished for multiple benefits. Realizing as land is coming out of production and realizing as projects move forward, they need to be set up that they're multi-purpose, multi-benefit, so that we're covering a number of these needs And then lastly, just recognize in order to get this done, we really need to align local, state, and federal policies and funding, in particular, with an emphasis on providing resources for the local government who have such a stepped up role, especially because of Sigma, and historically have had not necessarily the personnel, the resources to cover these matters. And so really looking for additional support for local government. I'll kind of stop there and talk a little bit. I mentioned a number of those kind of solutions, and I'll let Scott talk a little bit about, in particular, the environmental one, for example, of what we're looking at doing and how we're looking at doing it.
Hey, Austin, good morning, everybody. Thank you for your interest in this. I think you'll find that the potential benefits here go well beyond the valley. But as Austin mentioned, one of the key ambitions of the blueprint is to restore a lot of the habitat that we've lost in the valley. And without spending a lot of time on that, in the collaborative action program, Austin touched on a lot of the solutions that have been developed at a high level. In 2022, we're really looking to put some detail onto that. So we're looking forward to working with the environmentalists to see just what we can do here in the valley in terms of habitat restoration. As Austin said, there's going to be a lot of land coming out of production. What we want to try and do is to take that land out strategically so that we can maximize the benefits for the valley. Next slide, please. So, as Austin said, we've got this daunting gap of 2 to 3 million acre feet. If we capture all of the unused high flows in the valley from all of the east side rivers, there's maybe something in the order of 250 to 600,000 acre feet there. Any benefits from reclamation and recycling are going to be pretty minimal. And increased efficiency is actually going to only help in certain areas where we've got contaminated groundwater. Otherwise, increased efficiency doesn't really help achieve groundwater sustainability. So that really sort of turns us to the Delta as sort of the last but necessary place. And while it's only one element of the blueprint strategy, it really is sort of the linchpin of it. So I'm going to spend essentially all of the rest of the time today just on that. We can go to the next slide, please. So as Austin mentioned, the Public Policy Institute of California took a close look at how water was being used in the Delta right now. And you can see with the red bars, that's the in-Delta use. We've got ecosystem use, the existing Delta exports are in that gray color. The system water, which is the amount of flow that's needed in the Delta to maintain the water quality standards, to ensure that the M&I entities in the Delta get good quality water. And then the burgundy bars on top is the uncaptured water. It's the water that's available after all of the other uses or needs in the Delta have been met. And so you can see in some years, like in 1983, that number was enormous. But you've got drought cycles from like 1987 through 1992, where there's essentially no surplus water. And then you have the wet year cycle from 95 through 99, where there is still, more than 10 million acre feet of water, of uncaptured water going out the Delta. So the question there is, how much of that can actually be captured? If we go to the next slide, please. So the reason why we can't capture that water right now, as you are well aware, is because of the protections for endangered fish. All of that water right now essentially comes from in the winter and the springtime. So we have these very large outflows through a fairly short, period of several months in the Delta. But that's exactly the same time that either the salmon are moving through the Delta, or we've got Delta smelt dispersing in the Delta and potentially vulnerable to entrainment at the pumps. So the question then becomes, what can we do about that? How can we get water out of the Delta without hurting the fish? So if we go to the next slide. So there's a group of us that have been working on this for quite some time, but the concept is really fairly simple. A lot of the traditional screens for diversions are vertical screens at the side of the water column. And so we got to thinking, well, what happens if we took the water out of the bottom of the water column? What would happen if we had perforated pipes in some sort of gravel media at the bottom of the water column? This would then, it would be a much larger area than the traditional vertical screens. And so the velocities would be much, much slower. So what would happen is you not only have a physical barrier between the fish and the pipes that are diverting the water, but fish have this natural buoyancy that keeps them in the water column. Even larval delta smelt, that are by far the most sensitive of the species that we've studied, have this natural buoyancy even when they first hatch with their yolk sacs that keep them buoyant in the water. So as long as the vertical velocities are slow enough, the fish will stay in the water column. This actually gives us now the potential to divert water without harming fish at all. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this is actually not a new concept at all. It's been employed in various rivers around the country since the 1930s. Most of those are fairly expensive because they had to drill underneath the river to put the perforated pipes in place. The closest thing that we've found to the concept that we're talking about is a project that Turlock Irrigation District did on the Tuolumne River to protect salmon runs there. Here, as the photo shows, they had actually gone in by moving sort of the river over to the side. They were able to go in and construct these subsurface diversions when it was dry. And then put the gravel media over the top of that. So this is similar to what we're thinking about. We're considering a much smaller pipe over, something maybe in the in a 4 to 6 inch diameter pipe. These are 2 feet diameter pipes with a lot of perforations. Ours would be spread out over a much bigger area. But this is very exciting sort of technology here for changing the way that we divert water. We're thinking that in this day and age, we should be able to divert water without hurting fish, and this technology essentially opens the door to doing that. Can you go to the next slide then, please? So this is essentially what it would look like in the delta and this is conceptual. We've got no particular site in mind. But imagine this started off as a delta island. And as most of you are aware, a lot of the islands in the delta are already subsided, which means that it reduces the amount of excavation that would be needed to make this work. So the infiltration beds, that's where these perforated pipes would be. And they would flow unimpeded into those collector channels. At the end of the collector channels, then we would have the pump stations that would pump the water out to wherever it was needed. So all of that would get constructed when it's dry. And then once it was all constructed, then we'd take down the outside levees. So what that then allows is that the water then the tidal water can just move back and forwards over the top of the infiltration beds. That's very different to how the delta diversions are constructed now. The delta diversions are essentially a dead end for the fish. So once they move down into like Clifton Court Fall Bay, there is no escape for them. In this concept here, the fish would just move back and forwards over the top of the infiltration beds, just as if it was any other part of the delta. Next slide, please. So then the question is, well, how much water can you actually get out? Because we've got, obviously in the very wet periods, we can't capture all of that water. The volumes are just too great. Our pumping capacities are too limited. And so we had MBK do some studies on some different scenarios using fish running diversions, which is what we're calling this concept. And there's a lot of detail here, but generally you can sort of see, so on the left-hand side, right, the vertical axis of the graph, you've got all those codes, and what those codes mean are on the top left-hand side of the slide. But what we're most interested in are the ones that have the FFD, the fish frame diversion concept. And so the top three and then the fifth one down have this fish frame diversion concept as part of a bigger portfolio. And you can see in those cases that we've got 1.5 to 1.7 million acre feet of water that can be diverted. So this would be to serve both the SWP and the CVP. And this is the connection, I think, where you might be most interested, is that the concept here obviously is to keep all of the existing contractual obligations in place. That means that the first word diverted here would be to meet the existing state water project contracts. So for Metropolitan, that would be something in the order of a 15% increase in Table A and a much, much bigger increase in Article 21 water for storage. The concept then to help the valley is to make the fish frame diversions big enough that we can like fully utilize the pumping capacity at both the CVP and SWP. In other words, we would fully saturate the demands. So after we meet the Table A demands, then presumably the next use of the water would be to fill San Luis Reservoir. That would, in most years, prevent the circumstance that we're in right now. It would mean that San Luis Reservoir would be full essentially right after the first flush of the year. We should never be starting the year with a zero allocation. We should have San Luis full, which should give us a 25% initial allocation in most years. So this is a really important benefit for the existing state water contractors. The benefit then to the valley, because most of the valley is obviously not in the state water project place of use. Part of Kern, or nearly all of Kern County is, and part of Kings County. But it is in the CVP place of use. So the thought there is that we have so much water being diverted. So if we could divert 15,000 second feet of water, we could saturate all of the CVP contractual demands, all of the SWP contractual demands, fill San Luis Reservoir, and still allow Metropolitan to put water into all of its banking programs, and then still have so much water left over that we could bring that high flow winter and spring water into the valley for recharge. Like I said, it's winter and springtime water. It's not going to meet irrigation demands. It's going to meet groundwater sustainability. So that we're just putting it away to meet those groundwater sustainability needs. So next slide, please. And Austin, just jump in here. So I mentioned before, so most of the collaborative work that we've been doing now with the partners that Austin was talking about is the phase 1 work, which identified problems that people agreed on and very high level solutions. So in phase 2, which we're going to start this year, is to really figure out, to make those solutions a reality.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Scott. And so just kind of as a recap, as Scott had run through, a significant recognition here locally within the San Joaquin Valley, within the industries of changes upon us. And it requires, working together in order to, effectuate a better future. And so those items that we had, those desired kind of solutions and outcomes is kind of that second phase in implementing those. And so there's a series of probably about 90 or so action items amongst those 5 desired outcomes that we'll look to implement. And one of those really between now and the fall is having the caucuses really sit down and, as I mentioned, one scientifically and with area experts kind of look at what is feasible and what will be needed, especially from a water supply standpoint. Both, again, first and foremost, maximizing local water supplies here within the local watersheds and what is needed to capture and recharge those supplies. And then as well as looking at what if any opportunities done, again, in a very transparent collaborative and with outreach within the Delta with the respective management and operation agencies to see if is there a supply there. And that's very unique in that to have the environmental NGOs at least willing to recognizing the significant gap that exists and the demand that exists, looking at reducing that demand, but while simultaneously also looking at additional supplies. And so that's really a significant outcome through this effort and really has provided a lot of optimism amongst the respective caucuses to do that in concert. And so, with that and kind of that planning, and then ultimately looking at how that gets implemented, which on a number of these will take, years, if not decades to do. But it's fundamental that we put a plan or a blueprint in place for what we want the valley to look like in the future. Otherwise, leaving it up to fate in an unplanned and unorganized manner, I think will only lead to detriment to those of us in the valley, and then especially those that need assistance the most. So really appreciate the willingness to kind of run through and share what we're trying to do here in the San Joaquin Valley. Again, Scott and I are in these roles on a voluntary basis, as are most people that are participating in this effort, which really shows, I think, the universal kind of desire to do something a little bit different and do something that can be impactful and beneficial. But as we all know, water in the state and even in the West is all interconnected. And so we're in this together, and where we can find partnerships and coordination with, Southern California and Northern California, it's essential for the success of this pursuit. And so with that, it probably, concludes our presentation. Sorry if we ran a little bit long.
Thank you so much, Austin and Scott. If you have any questions for our speakers, please type them in the chat box or use your raise hand feature, and staff will facilitate the questions and answers. Staff, take it away.
Great, thank you. I did see Director Monin right in the chat box that he has a question.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Great presentation, Scott and Austin. Very interesting. I did have a question, and maybe I missed something. How much is this going to cost, and who's going to pay for it? Thank you.
All right, yeah. Great question.
Yeah, those are excellent questions, and obviously fundamental to things actually getting implemented. Ultimately, it's going to have to be a combination of sources, and depending upon what is collectively identified as those things that can be universally implemented. And that means that the 5 respective caucuses are in agreement of what is a priority and what should be implemented. That will dictate, ultimately what the costs are, but rest assured they're significant costs. Obviously looking at those, more so of groundwater recharge versus, surface water storage, that, there's a difference fundamentally in what those costs are, but that's where, estimates and engineering estimates come about. But it'd be a public-private, partnership, beneficiary pays kind of approach, but surely would be looking at both state and federal funding sources, which we've seen an increase of desirability and funds available both at a state and a federal level as the West continues to face drought, with the recently passed infrastructure legislation in the fall, as well as those funds that were identified by the governor in the budget this previous year. So funds like those are essential to the success of this.
Stacy.
Great. Thanks so much. Good morning, Scott and Austin. Thanks so much for being here today. Really appreciate it. It's great chatting with you at the conference, Austin, and working with you guys ahead of the presentation. We heard at this prior WACO one of the speakers mentioned that part of the issue or the challenge is that the agricultural crops have changed from rotating and seasonal to year-round permanent, thus hardening water demand for the ag sector in California. I was curious about your thoughts about that statement, and if that is the case, what can be done? Is that something that your program would work on? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stacy. Appreciate the invitation and allowing us to kind of present. This effort, both the Collaborative Action Program and the Blueprint, are really focused on moving forward and solutions to the issues before us. Now part of the demand, whether it's the environmental, the drinking water sources, or the demand used for industry, have changed over time and will continue to change over time. As whether it's industry in Southern or Northern California or here in the Central Valley, the products that are grown have continued to evolve. Over the years, you've seen an increase in more permanent plantings, and that's generally, like a lot of industry, is economically driven. But there is a recognition and the reality that crops are going to have to come out of production. Agriculture will have to come out of production. There is not enough water to meet the needs within the San Joaquin Valley. And so in turn, there's the respective groundwater sustainability agencies and others are putting in plans for what that means of how best to transition their grounds out of certain production in order to sustain the underlying aquifer and rely on a water source that can allow certain crop types. So that's being done, within those GSAs. It's not something that the Blueprint or the Collaborative Action Program is dealing with, nor could it, but it is occurring because without an adequate water source, you'll have to modify what's grown and when it's grown.
Thank you. Director Sullivan.
Yes, thank you very much. It's Pierce One, Irvine Ranch Water District. This is for Scott. How much land are you going to need to do this? Is this something envisioned on the Met Islands? And don't you have to have really direct access to the Sac River so you can get good flow and you don't have reverse flow problems and catching, the fish in all the tributaries in the Delta? That's first. And second, in order to make this work, you really have to increase, restore the capacity in both the State Water Project and the Friant, because if you got your federal water out of the State Water Project, which you were talking about, that frees up water from the Friant system to go back down to the east side of the valley. So right now you can't do that because the impedance down by midway down the aqueduct. And did MBK, the third question is, did MBK look at the methyl hydrate and nitrates and everything that would be pulled into the system by having the subterranean drain system, sort of like a rainy well? It works really good when you have sandy soil, but the Delta doesn't have sandy soil, it has peat. So has that been looked at? So a number of questions there. And I guess someone brought up this, Stacy brought up the fact that there's way too much, permanent crops for what the reliable supply is. And is there some sort of, in your plan, is there some sort of proportional and fair work down on that demand so we have more, we don't have pictures of trees being uprooted every dry year? Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. I don't know if I can, if I missed some of your questions as we go through, please restate them for me. So Yeah, obviously you're, you know.
How much land and where?
Yeah. So in the Delta, to get this to work, we don't need a lot of land. We're talking, you know, maybe something in the order of 1,000 acres in total to get the quantities that we need. We're thinking of 2 different locations, not having it all in a single location. One would be in the South Delta, and then another one would be in the Central Delta, because, you know, as you're aware, the South Delta channels cannot handle the kind of capacities that we're talking about. So yes, one of the islands would be like totally a feasible option for the second location, and that would then prevent the or it would mean that we don't need any changes in the OMR regulations, that we could live with the existing OMR regulations. So that's important. On now, we're not talking about using any natural material for the media. What we're anticipating is that we're going to have a membrane underneath the gravel, and then pipes and gravel on top of that. So we're not going to be picking up contaminants in any of the peat soils that are currently in the Delta. This is not meant to be in any competition with the Cal Water Fix. This is meant to be a very complementary project. This is really just meant to capture the winter and springtime high flow water. So all of the benefit and the Cal Water Fix would still accrue to the people that are participating in that project. So P, you asked some other questions.
No, I don't think so.
Yep. So you're going to lie this on top of the peat soil, you know, put gravel over the pipes and then a membrane. Is that the way? And how do you get around the flow restrictions on these channels, the McCulmey channels and everything going down to the South Delta, when you take all this new water in to infiltrate it and export it?
Yeah, so membrane that we would have would be on the bottom. And then we would only have, then the gravel and the pipes would be on top of that. So it's that membrane that keeps the peat soil and the organics out of the system. Yeah, so the channels in the South Delta can't handle the capacities that we're talking about. So we would need some other system. So, you know, so let's suppose that this system, you know, with Metropolitan's cooperation and participation would say go on Bacon Island. Then we would need some method of getting that water from Bacon Island down to the state and federal pumping facilities. That could either be a tunnel or it could be a new surface canal. And we haven't got down to that level of detail yet.
Thank you.
Director Seckel, and then we'll jump into some chat box questions as well.
Thank you all for the presentation. Very interesting. Wondered if either one of you or both could comment on how this fits in with the work going on currently by the State Water Resources Control Board and the voluntary agreements and sort of their desire to look at going back to unimpaired flows that would be required to meet, I guess, what they would be determined to be regulatory needs. Just wondering where you're at in that process and how that might affect your proposals. And thank you again for the presentation today.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. Yeah, obviously, the water quality control plans, the phase 1 and phase 2, will have an effect. The blueprint or the CAP doesn't really have a role. It's respective parties within the caucuses, especially those within the water agencies and others, have their own kind of separate involvement through that process. But ultimately, whatever the result is, organization and group like the Blueprint or Collaborative Action Program, we will have to deal with what the results are and what that means for water in or out of the system. As I laid out earlier, Dr. Sundig's analysis which had to make, a couple different assumptions based upon water supply in the system. Again, taking into account climate change, taking into account full implementation of the San Joaquin River Settlement Act and others. And again, they're guessing, they're educated guesses, but that will change depending upon the implementation of the state board's control plans on flows. And so whatever the result is, whether it's the result of voluntary agreements amongst the parties or the inability to reach an agreement and in turn implementation of the plans, that result will need to work with as the baseline of what water is available to be captured, when is that water available to be captured, what's the best use for it, how can we enhance environmental resources, how can we look for opportunities to recharge water. But I guess we are the blessing and the burden of just dealing with the results. But then again, here in California water, it's ever changing. So, but a number of the parties, within these efforts are dealing with that, directly and on a daily basis.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I'll read some questions in the chat box here. So either Scott or Austin, please feel free to jump in. Carol Moore is asking, how might this affect saltwater intrusion issues?
It's probably a Scott question.
Yeah. So again, this is low winter and springtime water. So this is not coming at a time when we've normally got salt intrusion issues in the Delta. This is when we've got massive Delta outflows, tens of thousands of second feet going out to the Delta. So it really won't affect the salt intrusion issue in the Delta is real, but this is not going to come at a time when that's actually an issue.
Thank you, Scott. Director Rowe asks, can you elaborate on flood managed aquifer recharge plans you have to capture? Or you have to capture more storm flows for groundwater recharge?
Yeah, I didn't touch on that, but that's obviously a very big part of the solution here in the Valley. And I apologize, I've got a lawnmower outside right now. So I might have to pass it off, but we need huge increases in the capacity to recharge flood water in the Valley. And that can happen both through on-farm recharge and through more constructed recharge. And we need orders of magnitude higher capacity than we've got now. I think we need something in the order of 70,000 acres of recharge, either on-farm or dedicated.
Thank you. Director Dick asks, who selects what acres are fallowed? Any compensation to them planned?
I guess that there's quite a bit to that question, a good question. And that's really based upon the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. That responsibility rests with the respective groundwater sustainability agencies in order to find sustainability as defined by the Act. Now, if it's determined that it's not being achieved by what would be the overarching regulatory kind of bodies between the Department of Water Resources and ultimately the state board. But those GSAs are looking at within their boundaries, how do they achieve sustainability? But what the blueprint and the collaborative action program hope to accomplish is, instead of just taking little corners of the San Joaquin Valley in this case, that be done in a bit more of a coordinated manner, or at least a planned manner, so that we don't end up with a series of patchwork. Whether it's PPIC's report or Dr. Sundig's report, you're looking at somewhere potentially, if there aren't really any changes, 500,000 to 1 million acres coming out of production. Well, what alternative uses can be put to use? The state passed last year a land repurposing bill that allowed for kind of a voluntary basis for money for lands to be put out of production and some monies to be paid to those parties. So it's going to be a combination of different resources and opportunities. Hopefully more so on a voluntary basis that kind of achieves a more coordinated land planning effort that really hasn't been done, but should be done, whether it's uses for renewable resources, whether it's looking at areas that serve better purposes for habitat or corridor connectivity. But again, that's where you'll need to get the counties involved from land planning. So a very, very complex effort, but with no one doing anything, it's really just the GSAs and what they can do within their respective boundaries. But hopefully we'll see a much larger, broader land planning basis throughout the entire valley, so we don't just end up with kind of a patchwork plan.
Thank you, Austin. And I believe you have covered this, but I'll recite it in case there's more to elaborate on. Howard Hull is asking, 90% of the wetlands are gone in the valley. Of the 10% remaining, 90% are controlled by duck hunters and Ducks Unlimited, who has been adding thousands of acres each year of wetlands. How much are you working with them, as well as California Waterfowl, another NGO, perhaps?
Yeah, so Grasslands Water District, which manages predominantly, the largest, I think the largest wetland flyway in the Western United States, but Ducks Unlimited has been in discussions and other environmental groups, but they are fundamental to this pursuit, understanding the needs, identifying the resources that assist in that effort, and the best ways to help them kind of accomplish their missions, but doing it in a coordinated manner for sure.
And I might just add that as you move further south in the valley, a lot of those wildlife refuges and the duck clubs had relied on groundwater to wet up their wetlands. So they are impacted more strongly than a lot of the farmers in the valley, because they essentially have a very limited groundwater right. And so this is presenting a very severe problem for them. The Pixley Irrigation District relied solely on groundwater. Like they don't even have a mechanism to get federal water to the wildlife refuge right now. So part of our plan here is to figure out how we can get water to those wetlands that would not otherwise have it. And if we can get, they need to be a part of the solution for sustainability in the valley as well. So so we need to figure out how we can build them into the solution, and we're working with the NGOs to do that.
Thank you. And Director Miller, you have your hand raised, and then we'll try and address some of these last few questions in the chat box here after.
This question, thank you both speakers for coming. I thought it was very interesting and informative. I had a question for Austin. In your collaborative efforts, I know in the original Twin Tunnels project that the agricultural entities in the San Joaquin Valley were not supportive, at least financially, going back to, I think it was Tracy's initial question. So what is the current outlook for getting some agricultural support if they go forward with a single tunnel? Is that clear, Austin? Or?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're in the process. This the respective collaborative effort really, and with the caucuses, is the idea now to go through and identify what are universally acceptable projects. And in some regards, it's probably, is there some low-hanging fruit of sorts? But what we've seen as we've sat at the table is, surface water storage projects and or delta conveyance projects are very sensitive to a number of groups. And so we need to try to identify what projects are palatable, what projects are doable, and then obviously there's an economic component to that as well, because you're just not able to complete those without it. But I think, the group's willing to look at, all sorts of projects and what they mean, but by no means have specific ones been identified as these are the ones that these collaborative efforts are pursuing. And I think there's, especially when it comes to the Delta, a recognition of there's a lot of examples of, there aren't a lot of successes to point to. So how do we learn from that and try to move forward with something that will work, that can be, impactful?
I guess my point, Austin, is that clearly it's technically feasible to put in either single, double tunnel to move water. And so the question is now the economic hurdle. And so I was really, since you're in the midst of these collaborations, is there any change in thinking in the San Joaquin farmers? Because like Scott says, they're going to have to, take land out of production. And I wasn't sure if their current thinking from 2 years ago is changing. That's where I'm coming.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And I can, taking off, let's say, a blueprint or collaborative action program hat, I mean, I can give you, I guess, a perspective of industry within the San Joaquin Valley as it relates to a single canal. I think there's a growing interest, I think, probably as it relates to it because of the growing need for a consistent supply coming out of the Delta. The one thing that Sigma did is that it's increased the pool of parties that would be interested. Before, you really were looking at just districts alone. And in this case, you now have parties that don't have any other alternative except to look to groundwater. And so you've got a much more motivated group of folks, those parties that weren't annexed or included within districts that provide a larger, let's say, buyer pool. So, again, it comes down to economics and, the cost associated with moving the water and using that then water for agricultural purposes is quite a bit different than moving the water and using it for, urban purposes, which had been the issue that we'd seen in the past. But I think there's growing interest at looking at it and whether or not the economics make sense still.
And if I could just add to that, really what prevented a lot of farmers from participating in the twin tunnels was the cost. With that water being $1,000 an acre foot or more, that was just essentially unaffordable for everyone except a few very, a small number of very profitable crops with very high yields. But for most of agriculture, that was just simply unaffordable. The cost of water out of fishery and diversions is going to be something closer to $100 than $1,000. And so that makes it just so much more affordable. It doesn't have the reliability that you get with the twin tunnels. It doesn't have the persistent water quality benefits that you have, but the farmers don't need that. If they can get the high flow waters into the groundwater basin, then they can live with that. They don't need the reliable surface supply. They need to be able to regulate these high flows. So it is very much an economic issue for farmers.
Director Green, I just wanted to do a time check. I know we're a few minutes to the hour, but we do have a few questions left. How would you like us to proceed?
Right. How do our Austin and Scott, are you able to stay for a few more questions? There's 1, 2, 3, 4 more questions.
Unfortunately, I am not, and I've gone off screen because my daughter keeps coming into the room. But I can stay probably just a couple more, and if not, I'm sure Scott can cover it, and I'm happy to follow up.
Okay,
as needed. Yeah.
Well, let me thank both of you, and then for those people who have to leave, thank you for joining us today. Our next WACO meeting will be February 4th at 7:30 via Zoom. Our next WACO Planning Committee meeting will be Tuesday, January 18th at 7:30 via Zoom too. I also want to congratulate Chuck Gibson on his appointment as chair of Region 10. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And if we can finish up these questions, Meta, that would be great.
Great, thank you, thank you. For those that can stay, let's go to the next one. What actions can Orange County take to support the blueprint?
I guess this might be my last, but one, thank you very much for that question. And we would absolutely love, I think one, the dialogue and the communication so that there's an awareness of what's taking place. And, as we're all aware of the interconnectivity of water here throughout the state, especially those supplies that move from north to south. But where we can have, your involvement, whether with your knowledge and relationships, and as these efforts move forward, there is a cost associated with them. Again, they're all done mostly on a voluntary basis, but where you either see or have programs that you think might be worthwhile to kind of contributing, whether it's to the technical side or to the collective effort, happy to chat with you about opportunities for any kind of contribution.
And if I just add to that, we are looking to do a pilot project that's going to cost about $4 million. We will be approaching the state water contractors and therefore Metropolitan to see if they've got an interest in participating in that. And so, to the extent that you can support us in that effort, that would be great.
Thank you. What efforts are considered for demand management with water use efficiency to increase crop yields with less water?
Yeah, interestingly enough, and this is sort of counterintuitive, but increasing crop efficiency doesn't, or the water efficiency in most cases doesn't actually help sustainability. So the farmers already have a very strong incentive to be efficient in the use of their water because it's so expensive. But if you put on too much water and you overlie a usable groundwater basin, that over application of water essentially goes back down into the groundwater basin. It's really, efficiency is really important when you're not in that situation where you've got either clay layers underneath you or that groundwater is contaminated. So that's where the efficiency really helps, but there's a lot of effort already underway to focus on efficient use of agricultural water. But in the end, the big difference is going to come from taking land out of production. That's ultimately what we're going to have to do to reduce ag water use.
Great. Do your plans include use of cloud seeding to increase rainfall and storm flows by 10 to 20%?
A lot of the districts, like a lot of the river interests do that right now. Like I know that the Kern River, those interests do that right now. I have very limited knowledge about the effectiveness of that. What I have heard is that yes, it is effective, but not so much locally. So when the Kern River folks did a study on that, they found that it did increase precipitation, but the benefits went all the way over to Colorado. So I think there's local interest in pursuing that further.
And has the price of beef resulted in any increase in use of Delta land for pasture? And if so, how does that affect water demand?
Way out of my league, I'm afraid. That question. I wasn't aware that there was a lot of beef production in the Delta anyway. A little bit when I'm out there driving around. We see a lot of land use changes with more land going into vineyards and almond orchards and less so on beef. So I really don't have a good answer for that one. I'm sorry.
No problem. And I did get one final question, Director Green. It was a direct message to me. So if I may recite that from Director Gibson. Scott, have you looked into the 7 water storage improvement projects recently validated by the California Water Commission? and their possible impact on your program's goals for recharge? And can you name some of the projects that may have the greatest impact?
So this is not necessarily a blueprint perspective as much as it might be mine, but for agriculture, so I'm not talking about M&I right now, but for agriculture, I think we've sort of seen the end of an era for reservoir construction. I think we saw with Temperance Flat that surface reservoirs for agriculture are just way too expensive. And both in the wet and dry year cycles that we see in California, reservoirs don't really work that well. When you have these really wet years, the reservoir gets filled up very quickly, and then you've got a lot of runoff that's just uncaptured. And then you get into a drought year or drought cycle, the reservoir is essentially empty by the end of the second year, and then for the rest of the drought cycle, it's just not helpful. Groundwater storage, on the other hand, and PPIC put out this sort of interesting graphic, like the capacity for groundwater storage just dwarfs surface storage. And so it makes, in California's, when I first started in the Valley, I had a mentor that said, the basic thing you have to understand about California water is we have periods where we have a lot of it, and we have periods where we have none of it. And that's what you've got to work with. And so the groundwater storage allows us to do that, allows us to really capitalize on those wet years, and then to bring it out, in the dry years. And a lot of that infrastructure is already in place to make that happen. The fish rent diversion project relies on surplus capacity in the California Aqueduct and the Dolomite Canal. So in the winter and springtime, there's essentially no irrigation demands. We have a lot of capacity to move that water. With on-farm recharge, we've got the ability to put a lot of water in the ground. To me, that is the economical solution for agriculture.
All right. Meta, is that all the questions?
That takes us to the end.
All right. Thank
Well,
you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate your interest here. I left my email in the chat, so if anyone thinks of any other questions I'd like, please just email me and I'll try and get back to you.
Thank you very much. Everybody, thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Scott, for staying so longer, and have a good weekend. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Meeting's adjourned.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
How did that go?